Hello and happy weekend. Before we begin, I want to just mention that I'm using a new app for streaming here. So in the past, I've used OBS, which works great. But then I remembered that I had a lifetime subscription that I bought years and years and years ago to XSplit. So I thought I would give that a shot. So I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are. If there's any difference behind the scenes, things are a little bit different. And end result hopefully should not be that much different. It's a little bit easier to control. The key thing here is that OBS, for whatever reason, the camera that I'm using, it didn't like to actually do it in HD. It said it did, but it didn't actually do it in HD. And so XSplit does. All right. So with that said, I'm going to press on, and by all means, let me know in the comments if you notice any issues or anything going on. All right, so the first thing I do want to mention is that, as you probably have noticed on the channel, I haven't done a lot of actual podcasts themselves on the actual channel. So this, what you're watching right now, this is the behind the scenes of the audio podcast based on a true story, and this is not the actual podcast itself. Really, what I'm using YouTube for is the behind the scenes of that show. So there's a lot of people that listen to that audio podcast, and I had previously posted some stuff on the YouTube channel that was the audio podcast, but I've kind of gone away from that, and I'm just kind of posting behind the scenes stuff here on YouTube. So that's what this is here. So if you want to listen to the audio podcast, if you're watching this and you're like, I don't know what's going on, I don't know what Based on a True Story is, I don't know who you are. That's very fair points. Based on a True Story is an audio podcast. I'm Dan Lefebvre. I'm the host of Based on a True Story. And you can find the podcast in whatever podcast app you use. Personally, I use Pocket Cast. It's a great podcast app. There's Overcast. That's iOS only, but it's a great app. There's Podcast Addict. There's Radio Republic. There's Dogcatcher. There's a ton of different podcast apps out there. And if you search in any of them, no, Apple Podcasts is a big one, of course. If you search in any of them for Based on a True Story, you'll find the logo, Based on a True Story, which you can see on my monitors back there, and you saw in the beginning of this video. And subscribe there, and you'll be able to listen to the actual audio podcast and hear the final edited versions of the show. So with that in mind, oh, by the way, if you have a favorite podcast app, add them to the comments below, because I've used Pocket Cast for years and years and years, and I know they recently went through an interface update, and it's one of those things that I was on the beta track for it, so I got used to it long before it became fully public, and I'll admit I had some issues with it. Once I kind of got used to it, it's okay. But if you have other recommendations, I'd love to hear them, so feel free to add those to the comment. All right, so what's going on with Based on a True Story? So, as you may or may not know, I record the podcast a little bit ahead of time. I do that to try to maintain that consistent schedule. And, you know, the schedule of producing the show, creating the show is not as consistent as I'm doing all of this in my spare time. So it's something that is try to balance that out by working ahead. And this past week, if you're a longtime listener, you'll know I don't usually do interviews, but this past week I did an interview for the podcast. And the decision to not do interviews is a conscious one that I decided when I started the show, because I used to do an interview-based podcast, and the scheduling around that, I did that as part of my 9-to-5 job during the day. And it was a lot easier to schedule when you're doing a podcast for your 9-to-5, when you're doing it as part of your full-time job, because you can just schedule it anytime when you're at work, right? And when you're doing it like I am with Based on a True Story, and like a lot of other independent podcasters do, it's in your spare time. And so finding that time where you can actually sit down with someone real time and have that conversation is very difficult to do. And there's a lot of independent podcasters that do that, and hats off to them. They're able to do that. Unfortunately, that doesn't really work a lot with my schedule. So that's why I don't do a lot of interviews on Based on a True Story. But there's an event coming up, and there's this particular person that I wanted to get on the show. I've wanted to get him on the show for a long time. I've just not really reached out to him. And it was one of those things kind of sitting in back of my mind. I really wanted to get him. I really wanted to get him on the show, and I really wanted to talk to him. And this past week, I finally reached out to him. I figured, there's a few months until the episode would go live, and that should give plenty of time to figure out the scheduling and figure out what's going to work. Well, he contacted me right back, and we scheduled something right away because he was going out of town, and so he was able to get me into his schedule before he left, and we recorded the interview, and it went really, really well. It was so much fun. So I'll give you a little peek, and that interview was with Marty Morgan. So if you're not familiar with who Marty is, he's the definition of an authority on D-Day. In fact, one reason why we did the interview ahead of time, as I mentioned, he was going out of town. He leads tours on the beaches of Normandy. So he walks people through the actual events that happened and explains what actually happened when they were there. And he's been doing that for like the past 18 years, almost 2 decades. On top of that, he's an author. He's been a historical consultant on movies and TV shows. So he's familiar with that side of things and the entertainment side of things. And he's also done video games. So if you've played Call of Duty World War II, he was the historical consultant on that game for Sledgehammer Games. So he was the one that Sledgehammer went to when they were making the game to decide what was historically accurate and what was not. And of course, not necessarily saying that they took all of his advice, because that's, as you know, when you watch movies or you play games, it's not always going to be historically accurate. A lot of that is a decision well above any historical consultant. That's a direction or producer's decision, all that kind of stuff. But I was super excited to get Marty on the show. We had a great conversation. I learned a ton of stuff from him in that conversation. I can't wait to hear what you think about it. So I'm prepping that, getting that ready. That episode will come out in June, just in time for D-Day. So in the meantime, there are a few episodes coming out that I will let you know about. So this is Saturday, April 13th, as I'm recording this, and Monday we are having a new episode come out, of course, as we do every Monday. It is an off week for the public episode or the public podcast, so that means that we're having a mini-sode come out. The mini-sode that comes out on the producer's feed, that is looking at the Disney movie A Kid in King Arthur's Court. That was a fun one to do. It's, kind of diving back into King Arthur and Camelot and some of that. I love, medieval times and that aspect of it. So it was fun to dig into there. Of course, there's the time travel aspect of that. And, there's a lot of stuff that obviously is not 100% realistic, the kid being sent back in time there. But there's that. And to be fair, I'm going to go off a little bit off from my notes here. And I mentioned the time travel aspect being a little unrealistic. To be fair, there's a lot of scientists that have done a lot of research, especially recently, and reading some fascinating things. You saw the image about the black hole, and it's one of those things that, we thought we'd never be able to photograph, and science has come up with a way to be able to do that. And I was reading a very fascinating book. I'm trying to remember the author, Dr. David Masters, I believe. and the book. In fact, you know what? I'm going to do this live here. I'm just going to do a quick search for it, just so I can get you the right name. And this is live. That's the way it goes. So let's see. I think it was Dr. David Masters. Maybe not. Let me find the actual book here. Michael Masters. Okay, Dr. Michael Masters. So his book is called Identified Flying Objects, and I know what you're thinking right off the bat. It's UFOs and aliens, and it is in a way. But if you'll go with me here, he takes it from a very scientific background, or from a very scientific, a very scientific approach. So Dr. Masters is a professor of biological anthropology, and what he proposes in this book, and I would really recommend reading it. It's a deep dive into physics and science and the research into things like time travel and stuff like that. And his thought process in a very big nutshell that he proposes in the book is that there's a lot of people who have claimed to have seen what we know of as UFOs. And of course, they usually jump to either one, it just doesn't exist and it gets dismissed and nothing happened, or number two, it's aliens and they came from a long way away. And his proposal there is that with the science doesn't really seem to back up that they came from a long way away, from millions and millions of light years away, or wherever that may be. But then he goes into the idea that time as we know it, as we think of time right now, we think of it as something that's linear, like start to finish. And he mentions all this research that's going on about how maybe that's not the case. Maybe time as we know it is really more of our perception of time is different than what we might have actually thought all this time. So for all this time, we thought it was linear, and perhaps time, everything is actually happening all at once, right? So the things that I just said 10 minutes ago actually are happening all in the same realm, as if you were. And this is where it starts to get, there's a lot of the science is just way over my head, but well, it's all happening. And so if that's the case, then it's just how we're perceiving it that really is controlling what, or making it seem like it's a linear thing when perhaps it's not. And so if that's the case, if it is the case that time is not what we really have thought it to be for the, for a lot of human history, where it's just this straight linear thing, then perhaps we will find a way to be able to bend that perception. So thinking of it kind of like, I'm going to use the example of the black hole photo that we saw again. And that is that was something that if you think even just 100 years ago, we would never have considered being able to take a photograph of a black hole. And yet we have. And granted, it's not the clearest photograph, but it's one of those things that I'm sure it's only going to get better from here. And science is only going to improve, and things are only going to improve. And so, in a nutshell, this has kind of gone on to a bit of a tangent, but it was a fascinating book. And his theory there is that if the perception of time as we know it is perhaps not what we've always thought, then perhaps it is something that science one day will be able to bend or change, or not necessarily change, but we'll be able to perceive it in different ways. And so that then would essentially become time travel. And so perhaps and then he goes from the other side, because he is a professor in biological anthropology. So he goes the other side and goes into the evolution of humans. And so if you look at, from very early man in the evolution of humans and how we've progressed from, you know, our ancestors and into what we are today, and the human form has changed and we've become more upright, and a lot of that has lended to our heads changing, and our shape of our skulls changing, and the brains changing, and all of this leading into it. And then what we see, or what people seem to claim to experience as, what a lot of people say is extraterrestrials, or that side is, perhaps those are actually us, humans from the future, that have continued that evolution hundreds of thousands or millions of years in the future, and then they at that point have been able to visit us, uh, from the future. So it's a really fascinating book. I would recommend, if nothing else, give it a read. It's one of those things that, as I actually picked up the audiobook on Audible, and it's one of those that I've always been fascinated with the unknown, um, and it's something that it's a very scientific approach. It's a very, physics based approach, and it's pulling together a lot of different research and a lot of science that is very cutting edge in a way that just makes you think. It just makes you think. And I'm not saying I'm not 100%. I don't know if I believe it or not. I don't know. It's one of those things, but it's just it's very fascinating, if nothing else. So the book is called Identified Flying Objects by Dr. Michael Masters. Um, and I'd recommend going to check it out. That was a fascinating one, and not necessarily associated with the podcast at all. So I know that's a little bit of a tangent, but I mentioned, that on Monday we'll be covering A Kid in King Arthur's Court, and that movie talks about time travel and traveling back in time. So that's kind of where I went off on that tangent. Um, all right, so back to the podcast. Let me pull up my schedule here. So after the off week, so this Monday is the mini-sode. I say it's an off week. It's an off week for the public podcast. So the mini-sodes are much shorter. They're on the producer's feed, available to producers of the show, which are folks who are supporting the show through Patreon. And that is I mean, that's one of those things. I know Patreon has a bunch of tiers, and there's, you get bonus episodes at $5 tiers or $10 tiers. I used to do that, and I just decided, you know what? If when I'm listening to a show, I want to, if I want to be able to support the creator, I want to be able to do that. And um, I just, at whatever level I'm able to do. And it's not always $5 a month. It's not always $10 a month. Sometimes it's $1 a month. Sometimes, honestly, it's nothing. And it's just a shout out on social or something like that. And that's perfectly fine too. I realize that not everybody can support the show monetarily. And that's perfectly fine. But on Patreon, I've decided to do away with all the tiers and all the different levels and things like that. Just make it super simple. When you sign up to become a producer for the show, then it's going to ask you how much you're willing to give, and really that's up to you. Whatever you want. Patreon does, I think, have a minimum of $1 a month. And that's because of their processing fees. I end up getting a fraction of that, so a few cents a month. Um, but yeah, so there's no tiers or anything like that. It's just anybody that supports gets access to all of the bonus content. And on Monday, that is A Kid in King Arthur's Court. And then the following Monday, that will be on my calendar here. That's April 22nd. April 22nd is the next public episode, and that's a fun one to do. That one's already done, and I've actually a little bit ahead on that, so I've already got that one scheduled and ready to go. And that is the horse racing film Seabiscuit, and that's one that's been highly requested, and I've got a lot of people who have asked to cover that, and it was really fascinating to dig into that story. I'm not real familiar with the horse racing world. I'll be completely honest. And I've been to horse races. There's some here in Oklahoma City that I've been to, and it's fun to watch, fun to watch them run. I've ridden horses. I've lived in the country, and I've ridden horses, and they're fun to ride, and they're great animals. But it's not something that I've really, as a sport, that the history of I've not dug a lot into. So it was a lot of fun to do that, and I did a lot of that over the course of creating the episode for Seabiscuit. So hopefully you enjoyed that, and hopefully, again, as with all of the episodes, hopefully it inspires you to do some digging on your own. And I've said this before on the podcast. I'm sure I've said this before on YouTube on the behind the scenes, but I'll say it again because it bears repeating. Everything that I do on the podcast is really, I'm not trying to become a master, on any of those topics, because if you think about it, I'm creating a podcast that bounces around from topic to topic. So every single week I'm doing something else, like a kid in King Arthur's Court, and then going from that to Seabiscuit. I mean, then there's people that have dedicated decades. I go back to the interview about that I mentioned with Marty Morgan. He's dedicated the last almost 2 decades of his life researching and studying and going to and experiencing and teaching and writing about and all of this about D-Day and World War II and all of these facts. And that's something that you can't do when you're creating a podcast that bounces from subject to subject. So hopefully, that's one thing I always try to keep top of mind, and it's something that I always try to be very upfront and honest about, and recognizing that everything, my show is not intended to be, an all-in-one everything, the end of the story. What I'm hoping that my podcast is when you watch the movie, you're going to very naturally be like, oh, how much of that actually happened? And hopefully my show can kind of be that segue into giving you some of that information about how much actually happened, but then inspiring you and really kind of helping you down that path to finding some more research materials. So, finding more authors and historians and people who have written about this and who have dedicated their significant portions of their lives in many instances and their livelihoods and that to each individual topic, and so I'm hoping that Based on a True Story can be kind of the liaison between, think of it kind of like a stepping stone, right? So you watch the movie and then you listen to the podcast, and then hopefully you'll read more books or get in touch with authors or historians or go to classes or whatever that might be, and get a little more involved in that. And again, I recognize that not everybody's going to want to get that involved. That's perfectly fine. That's one of those things as well. Maybe you just want to listen to the podcast and then, maybe pick up the book and from one of the authors and that's it. Or maybe you don't even want to listen to the podcast. Maybe you just want to bypass the podcast and just pick up one of the books. That's perfectly fine too. I mean, I'm hoping that I can be kind of a middle ground between that, and not everybody needs or wants that, and that's perfectly fine as well. All right, well, I've kind of chatted your ear off for a little bit here, and I think that's about going to do it for now. I'm going to hop off here and start working on the next episode of the podcast, which hopefully, if all goes according to plan and I'm able to dedicate some time to it this weekend and over the next couple of weeks, then I will be back for another live stream and let you know what I've been working on. So, all right, just to recap, if you've been listening to this video or watching any of the behind the scenes on YouTube, I just want to reiterate that this is not the podcast. This is the behind the scenes of the podcast, kind of, my thoughts and kind of what it goes into creating a podcast on a consistent basis. So, the episode coming out on Monday is episode number, I don't remember, 135, I think it's 135. No, it's not 135. I'm not quite there yet. It's 132, I think. Let me do a quick search here. Hold on. Apologize. Let me look. It looks like it's 131. Yeah. Anyway, so, over 100 episodes, and, it's we're all always learning, but hopefully you can pick up some tips and tricks and things like that from this behind the scenes aspect of it as well. And share some of your own. I'm always learning as well. If you're creating a podcast, if you're creating content online, I'd love to hear from you, hear what your experiences are. Feel free to add them to the comments for this episode, or if you want to just reach out to me, you can reach out to me at dan@basedonatruestorypodcast.com. Let me know what your show is. I'd love to listen to it. Let me know what you like, how you do it, what is your process like, from start to finish. How do you create your podcast? If you're doing things like interviews and you're doing a show, you're an independent podcaster, you're doing your show in your spare time, and you're doing interviews, I'd love to hear how you do that, and maybe that's something that I can incorporate some of the things that you're doing, and be able to learn from you, and maybe have some more interviews on my own show as well. And maybe there's things that I can share with you that are helpful to you as well. And that's one thing I love about the podcasting community is everybody's really helpful with each other, and we realize that we're not competing. I'm creating essentially what boils down to every couple weeks I put out 45 minutes, an hour worth of content. And so, it takes a couple weeks to create that, but it's one of those things that it's not going there's plenty of time for other shows. And I listen to a ton of other podcasts, and I learn from a lot of other podcasters, and I always encourage that. And I always try to kind of pay it forward too, and try to help other podcasters when I can. All right. So with that, thank you for watching. Hopefully you're enjoying the audio podcast. If you're not subscribed, go subscribe in your podcast app of choice. And you can listen right now to the last episode that came out that is about the disaster movie with George Clooney and Matt Damon, The Perfect Storm. That is the most recent episode about the Andrea Gale. That's available now in your podcast app of choice, or you can go over to basedonatruestorypodcast.com and listen to it there, or you can go to basedonatruestorypodcast.com/subscribe and find all of the links, RSS links to Apple Podcasts, link to Google Podcasts, and subscribe to the show, the audio podcast over there. Thanks again for watching, and have a great week.